Okay, hopefully everybody has the specific outline. Anyone not have one, just raise your hand real quick. We'll get it to you. There's a hand over there. Just keep your hands up. There's several hands now, and we'll get that to you. Our study tonight is on the 8 stages of the Campaign of Armageddon. A way of introduction on the beginning of the outline. What we're going to be seeing in the tribulation is a development of a one world political system. There'll be two different political systems and two different systems of religion in the tribulation, one for each half of the tribulation. Now, the political system of the first half will be that of 10 kingdoms with 10 kings. Someday there'll be a restructuring of the borders we have today, and it'll end up with being 10 Gentile nations ruled by 10 Gentile kings plus Israel. And that will begin sometime before the tribulation starts, will continue until the midpoint of the tribulation. At the midpoint, things will change. The Antichrist will rise to power, and he'll declare war against all 10 kings. In that war, he will kill 3 of them, and then the other will simply submit his authority and therefore inaugurate the second political system in which he'll be the world ruler. Also be 2 different systems of religion, one for each half. And the religion of the first half is detailed in Revelation chapter 17 in terms of the ecclesiastical or religious Babylon, the unification of all world religions into one kind of a super religion, one super church, including all false denominations. And this one world church ruled the world religiously for the first half of the tribulation, will have the reluctant support of those 10 kings. The true believers of that day that will not submit to its spiritual religious authority will suffer persecution, and many will be martyred. But that too will change at the midpoint. At the midpoint, after the Antichrist gains world political authority, he will then he will take Jerusalem, and especially the Jewish temple, the third temple of that day, and there'll be a forced cessation of the sacrificial system. He will sit in the temple, proclaim himself to be God Almighty, and call upon the whole world to worship him as God and to signify their acceptance of his deity by taking his mark of 666. So from the midpoint till the end of the tribulation, when Armageddon begins, one man has ruled the world both politically and religiously. Normally, I do a series of studies. I don't start with Armageddon, but this is a one-night situation. There's another study I do beforehand called The Basis of Precondition to the Second Coming, which provides the reasons for Armageddon. I won't do the whole study, won't have time to do that, but I want to do certain elements from it. Let's begin then by turning to Leviticus chapter 26. Here's one of the key differences between the rapture of the church and the second coming for Israel. The rapture of the church has no preconditions. It can happen at any moment of time. It could even happen tonight. And the rapture is specifically God's program for the body of the Messiah, the church. But the actual second coming does have a key precondition. In chapter 26 of Leviticus, Moses outlines what will end up being Jewish history. Now, when he wrote this chapter, it was all prophecy. But much of this chapter has not been fulfilled. He points out when the Jewish people entered the land, they'll fall into different periods of disobedience. They'll bring on different types of divine discipline. First will come subjugation, and that was fulfilled in the days of the judges. Secondly will come captivity, and that was fulfilled by the Assyrian and the Babylonian captivities. But then comes a worldwide dispersion, which came as a direct result of Israel's rejection of the prophet like unto Moses of Deuteronomy 18, verses 15 through 18, Deuteronomy 18, verses 15 through 18. And so by the end of verse 39, the worldwide dispersion is a fact. And that much of this chapter has now been quite fulfilled and fulfilled literally. But Moses continued to write in verse 40, and they shall confess their iniquity and the iniquity of their fathers in the trespass which they trespassed against me. And also because they walked contrary unto me, I also walked contrary unto them, and brought them into the land of their enemies. If then their uncircumcised heart be humbled, and they then accept of the punishment of their iniquity, then will I remember my covenant with Jacob, and also my covenant with Isaac, and also my covenant with Jacob, and Abraham, and I'll remember the land. Notice in verse 42, God says he has every intent of fulfilling all the promises of the Abrahamic covenant sustained through Isaac and Jacob, and that includes the borders of the promised land. So it says, I will remember the land. But the precondition is found in verse 40, they shall confess their iniquity of their fathers. And notice the word iniquity is singular. And it was one sin that was committed by their forefathers, their ancestors, and continued that by them, which someday must be confessed before they begin to enjoy all of the blessings of the Abrahamic covenant. Now look at Jeremiah chapter 3. The prophet Jeremiah chapter 3. In verses 14 through 18, Jeremiah lists some of the blessings the Jews will enjoy once the Messianic kingdom or the millennium is finally established. So in verse 14, they'll be brought back one by one until every Jew is back in the land of Zion. In verse 15, God will at that time give them righteous shepherds that will feed them with knowledge and understanding and never be guilty of leading them astray. And in verse 16, they won't so much as think of rebuilding the Ark of the Covenant, because in verse 17, God himself in visible form in the person of the Messiah will rule from the city of Jerusalem. And in verse 18, the Jews will be so reunited so as never again to be split into two Jewish kingdoms again. But the enjoyment of all these messianic millennial conditions is preconditioned by verse 13. Only confess your iniquity, that you have transgressed against Jehovah your God. Here again, the word iniquity is both singular and specific. There is one specific sin that needs to be confessed before they can enjoy the blessings of the Messianic kingdom. Now we'll go to the book of Zechariah. The book of Zechariah, chapter 12. The last three chapters of Zechariah, chapters 12, 13, and 14, is one prophetic discourse, one prophetic revelation God gave the prophet. Now, chapter 13 deals with the removal and forgiveness of Israel's sins. And chapter 14 deals with two more things. In chapter 14, verses 1 through 15, it deals with the second coming. And in verses 16 through 21, it deals with the Messianic kingdom. But the removal of the sins and feeling forgiven of the sins at the second coming and kingdom is preconditioned by chapter 12, verse 10. I'll pour upon the house of David and upon the inhabitants of Jerusalem the spirit of grace and of supplication, and they shall look unto me whom they have pierced, and they shall mourn for him as one mourns for only son, and shall be in bitterness for him as one who is in bitterness for his firstborn. At some point there'll be an outpouring of the Spirit causing Israel to finally turn to the Messiah. And in chapter 12, verse 11 through chapter 13, verse 1, they'll go through a period of tremendous mourning and finally receive forgiveness of their sins. But the point being made is that until chapter 12, verse 10 is fulfilled, chapters 13 and 14 cannot be fulfilled. Let's go to the first minor prophet, Hosea chapter 5. Hosea chapter 5. And throughout the 5th chapter of Hosea, God is doing the speaking, and God is still speaking as we come to verse 15, where God says, I will go and return to my place until they confess their offense and seek my face. In their affliction, they will seek me earnestly. Now, before one can return to a place, he must first leave it. After leaving it, he could then return to it. And here God is speaking and says he's going to return to his place. God's place is heaven. Before God can return to heaven, he must first leave it. And when did he leave heaven? He left the heaven at the incarnation, when God became man, human, in the person of Jesus of Nazareth. Then because of an offense, and notice again the word offense is singular and specific, because of a specific offense committed against him, he returned to heaven when he ascended from the Mount of Olives. Verse 15 goes on to point out that he will not come back to this earth until that offense is confessed. Adding the warning, in their affliction they will seek me earnestly, and that affliction will include the tribulation in general, but more specifically, the campaign of Armageddon. Let's look at one more passage on this in Matthew chapter 23. In Matthew chapter 3, he closes public ministry to Israel, and he pronounces 7 woes on the leadership of Israel. For first of all, they reject his messianic claims, but they're also leading the nation to reject his claims as well. When he ends this denunciation of the leaders, he closes with a lament. And in verse 37, he summarizes his 3-year ministry to Israel. Often wanted to spread his hands out and give the holy city the messianic protection predicted by the prophets, but he could not because they rejected him. So in verse 38, their house, the Jewish temple, will soon lie desolate. It'll be destroyed 40 years after these words were spoken. But notice what he says in verse 39, still addressing the leaders. He says to them, For I say unto you, ye shall not see me henceforth, till ye shall say, Blessed is he who comes in the name of the Lord. And from the Jewish frame of reference of first century Israel, that was the official messianic reading. And rabbis were teaching when the Messiah comes, he must be welcomed with these words. For they come from a messianic psalm, Psalm 118 and verse 26. Psalm 118, verse 26. And they would not say these things until they accepted him as the Messiah. So just as the Jewish leaders years ago led the nation to reject him, which caused him to return to heaven, a day must come when the Jewish leaders will lead the nation to accept him, because that will be the basis of the second coming. In essence, the basis of the second coming involves 2 things. First of all, the confession of their sin, of rejecting him when he first came, and the words of that confession you'll find in Isaiah 53, verses 1 through 9, Isaiah 53, verses 1 through 9, where they confess that when he first came, they thought he was suffering for his own sins, and now they realized he was suffering for their sins. And then secondly, they must plead for the Messiah to return, to mourn for him as one mourns for only son. And some examples of this mourning will be found in Isaiah 64, Psalm 79, and Psalm 80. Isaiah 64, Psalm 79, and Psalm 80. So that is the precondition to the second coming. This was national salvation. And Satan knows this. And he knows that once the Messiah returns, his career will be over with. So he's always had this special war against the Jews throughout Jewish history from the time of Abraham. And that's why things like the Crusades occurred. That's why things like the Russian pogroms occurred. That's why Nazi Holocaust occurred, and that's why Revelation 12 mentions that once Satan is confined to the earth, which will begin at the midpoint of the tribulation, he knows his time is short, only 3.5 years before the second coming. And knowing his time is short, he's full of wrath, and uses the wrath to inaugurate a worldwide persecution of the Jewish people. And he will inaugurate a Nazi-like worldwide campaign. It'll be signaled by what the Bible calls the abomination of desolation, which is when the Antichrist takes over the temple to proclaim himself God Almighty. And that'll be a signal for the Jews to flee the land. And he begins the worldwide persecution according to Zechariah chapter 13, verse 8 and 9. Zechariah 13, verse 8 and 9. By the time we come to Armageddon, he succeeded in destroying 2/3 of the world Jewish population. 1/3 is left. And the purpose of Armageddon is to try to destroy 1/3 remnant that is still living in the closing days. And so with this, we can pick up the outline, and let's go to Revelation 16. The stages are on the bottom of the page, but there's a map on the top of the page that you can follow. And the first stage is the assembling of the allies of the Antichrist. The assemblings of the allies of the Antichrist. Verse 12, and the sixth poured out his bowl upon the great river Euphrates, and the water thereof was dried up, that the way might be made ready for the kings who come from the sun rising. And I saw coming up out of the mouth of the dragon, out of the mouth of the beast, out of the mouth of the false prophets, 3 unclean spirits as if it were frogs. And these are spirits of demons, the working signs which go forth unto the kings of the whole world to gather them together unto the war of the great day of God the Almighty. Verse 16, and they gathered them together into the place which is called in Hebrew Armageddon, or the mountain of Megiddo. The campaign will begin when the emperor of the world, the Antichrist, from his capital city, Babylon, which is on the banks of the Euphrates, will issue this decree to his allied kings to gather their armies and meet him in a specific locale in the land of Israel, and to make sure there was no reluctance on the part of those other kings to follow orders. Demonic spirits go out with this decree to make sure they fall into line. And to make sure it be easier for his own armies to maneuver, by this time the Euphrates River will be dried up, and the city of Babylon sits on both banks of the Euphrates. And the place where the Antichrist will meet with his armies will be the place called Armageddon. And Armageddon are 2 Hebrew words meaning the mountain of Megiddo. Now, the largest valley in Israel is called in the Bible the Valley of Jezreel, and Christians have come to call this whole valley the Valley of Armageddon, but the Bible never uses Armageddon for the whole valley. Rather refers to one specific city at the western edge of the valley, the city of Megiddo, and that's where the Antichrist will meet with all of his allied kings, but obviously all of the nations and their armies, rather, will have to be spread out in the valley of Jezreel itself. Now, the way this decree is viewed in Revelation chapter 16 is viewed from a human perspective, where the emperor of the world issues his decree and order for his subjected kings to meet him with their armies in the valley of Jezreel, the south end of the Galilee. Let's now turn to Joel chapter 3. Joel is the second minor prophet, Joel chapter 3, which gives us God's perspective of these armies coming together. Joel chapter 3, and look at verse 9. Joel 3, verse 9. Proclaim ye this among the nations, prepare war, stir up your mighty men, let all the men of war draw near, and let them come up. Beat your plowshares into swords, your pruning hooks into spears. Let the weak say, I am strong. Haste ye, And come, all ye nations round about, and gather yourselves together, till I cause your mighty ones to come down, O Jehovah. Now in this passage, we have God's perspective, and as he views all these armies coming together, he resorts to mockery. It's a bit stronger in Psalm 2. And in Psalm 2, as God sits in the heavens, watches all these armies coming together, the psalmist says, "He who sits in the heavens will laugh, and the Lord will have these nations in derision." So while in Psalm 2, God is laughing at them, in Joel 3, God is mocking them. As he says, go ahead and gather yourselves together. Go ahead and take your farming equipment and turn them into weapons of war. And those who are weak and cowardly, deceive yourselves and pretend that you're strong and courageous. While Satan and the Antichrist have no goal in this campaign to try to annihilate the Jewish remnants still living, God has his own purpose for allowing them to come together, and it is God's purpose that's going to be fulfilled. This final conflict in history has been referred to as the Battle of Armageddon, which is a bit of a misnomer, because Armageddon will not just be one battle, but several battles of an overall campaign. And furthermore, the Valley of Jezreel, or the Valley of Armageddon, will not be the place where the fighting will occur. It will simply serve as a gathering ground for the armies to come together. As we're about to see, the fighting will occur elsewhere. And there is a biblical name for this conflict, and it's found at the end of Revelation 16, verse 13. Revelation 16, verse 13. It is I think it's verse 14. The war of the great day of God the Almighty. The war of the great day of God the Almighty. And there's your biblical title for this final conflict. Let's go to stage 2 and turn now to Isaiah chapter 13. Isaiah chapter 13. Look at verse 1, Isaiah 13, verse 1. The burden of Babylon, which Isaiah the son of Amos did see, set you up an ensign upon the bare mountain, lift up the voice unto them, wave the hand, they may go into the gates of the nobles. I have commanded my consecrated ones. Ye, I have called my mighty men from mine anger, even my proudly exulting ones. The noise of a multitude in the mountains as of a great people, the noise of a tumult of the kingdoms of the nations gathered together. Jehovah of hosts is mustering the hosts for the battle. They come from a far country, from the uttermost parts of heaven, even Jehovah in the weapons of his indignation to destroy the whole land. The burden of Babylon, which Isaiah the son of Amos did see, is this. Well, there are armies gathering which are pro-Babylon armies and pro-Antichrist armies. Here we see other armies gathering, but these are anti-Babylon armies or Antichrist armies. And they're coming together for the express purpose of destroying the city of Babylon. The rest of chapter 13, all the way through chapter 14 and verse 23, 14:23, he gives us the details of how Babylon will be destroyed. Now, the timing of this event is provided both in verse 6 of chapter 13 and verse 9. The day of Yahweh, the day of Jehovah, the day of the Lord. And that is the most common biblical term in both testaments for the tribulation. Our most common term today is tribulation, great tribulation, but the most common biblical term is the day of Jehovah, the day of the Lord. And that is always a time of special divine judgment just preceding the establishment of the kingdom. And furthermore, as he describes these events in chapter 14, verses 1 and 2, notice 14, 1 and 2, it's in connection with Israel's final restoration to the land. And that's a restoration that occurs following the Campaign of Armageddon. And so he's describing not this, what he describes in these two chapters was never fulfilled in history. It was fulfilled, is going to be fulfilled in part of the Armageddon campaign. And now let's go to Jeremiah's account in Jeremiah 50. I should mention there are 5 chapters that describe this second stage, which includes Isaiah 13 and 14, Jeremiah 50 and 51, and Revelation chapter 18. But for time's sake, we'll limit ourselves to the Isaiah passages we just looked at and also Jeremiah. Jeremiah 50, verse 9. Jeremiah 50, verse 9. For lo, I will stir up and cause to come up against Babylon a company of great nations from the north country, and they shall set themselves in array against her. From thence she shall be taken. Their arrows shall be of an expert mighty man, and none shall return in vain. And Chaldea shall be a prey. All that prey upon her shall be satisfied, says Jehovah. Now skip over to verse 41, chapter 50, verse 41. Behold, a people come from the north, and a great nation, and many kings shall be stirred up from the uttermost parts of the earth. They lay hold on bow and spear. They are cruel and have no mercy. Their voice roars like the sea, and they ride upon horses, every one set in array, as a man to the battle against you, O daughter of Babylon. And what Jeremiah sees is what Isaiah saw more than a century beforehand. Armies gathering together, which are anti-Babylon armies. And they're coming together for the express purpose of destroying the capital of the Antichrist. And in Isaiah chapter 13, verse 3, 13:3, the ones who are doing this are God's consecrated ones, God's sainted ones. And what this shows is that Gentile believers of this point of time that will not go with the party line will take the opportunity to destroy the capital of the Antichrist once he has removed his army from the city. What's important about Jeremiah is that he clearly shows that the king of Babylon is not within a city when these events occur. For example, look at verse 43. The king of Babylon had heard the tidings of them. His hands waxed feeble. Anguish had taken hold of him, and pangs as a woman in travail. Now with that, go to chapter 51 and verse 31. Chapter 51, verse 31. One post shall run to meet another, and one messenger to meet another, to tell the king of Babylon that the city tell the king the city has been taken every quarter, the passages are seized, the reeds are burned with fire, and the men of war are frightened. And the fact the messengers have to be sent out to inform the king of Babylon that the city has been taken and burned down by fire is the clear implication he's not within his own city when these events happen. So where would he be? And by comparing the passages of the first stage with these of the second, while the Antichrist is over in Galilee, in the valley of Jezreel, and have removed his own army from Babylon, his enemies, the consecrated ones, take the opportunity to destroy his city, and in Revelation 18 will do so suddenly and quickly and massively. Before anybody knows what's happening, Babylon, the economic and political capital, is burning and burning away. Let's go to the third stage and go to Zechariah chapter 12. Zechariah chapter 12. You would think that since he's heard from those messengers that he had enemies that destroyed his capital, and since he has his own armies and the other armies with him, we want to go back to the east to destroy his enemies. But it's not so much that the Antichrist is controlled, but Satan is. And Satan's aim in this campaign is not to save the Antichrist, but to save himself. And to save himself, he must destroy the Jews. And therefore, the armies will not head east, but they'll head south. And the third stage is the attack and the fall of Jerusalem. The attack and the fall of Jerusalem. Look at chapter 12, we'll start with verse 2. Behold, I will make Jerusalem a cup revealing unto all the peoples round about, and upon Judah also a beam in the siege against Jerusalem. It shall come to pass in that day that I will make Jerusalem a burdensome stone for all the peoples. All that burden themselves with it shall be sorely wounded. And then notice, and all the nations of the earth shall be gathered together against it. All the nations of the earth shall be gathered together against it. Now skip over to chapter 14, verse 1. Chapter 14, verse 1. Behold, a day of Jehovah comes, when your spoil shall be divided in the midst of you. For I will gather all nations against Jerusalem to battle. The city shall be taken, the houses rifled and ravished, and half of the city shall go forth into captivity, but the rest of the people shall not be cut off from the city. The armies move south, and they attack the city of Jerusalem. And this attack is followed by some heavy bit of fighting described in the two passages on your outline, Micah chapter 4, verse 9 to chapter 5, verse 1, and Zechariah chapter 12, verses 4 through 9. And both these passages describe the same thing, that God will energize the Jewish forces, so that the weak ones among the Jews will fight like David did, and the Davids among the Jews will fight like the angel of Yahweh, the angel of Jehovah, causing tremendous decimation in the ranks of the enemy. However, because of superiority in number, eventually the city does fall to these Gentile nations, and once again the city is trampled upon by armies of the Gentiles. And with this third stage, Jerusalem has fallen. However, the majority of the Jews still surviving are no longer in Jerusalem or even in the land. They have fled elsewhere. Now, as we mentioned, the abomination of desolation signals the Jews that to flee, and that to flee to the mountains, that to flee to desert territory. And while some remain behind, the most of the remnants still surviving, and the leaders flee to a specific place. And the place they flee to is found in Micah chapter 2, the minor prophet Micah chapter 2. Now, to understand what is intended by verse 12, because different translations render it a bit differently. Micah has three prophecies. Each prophecy is introduced by the phrase, "Hear ye." And the first prophecy comprises the first two chapters. And in this prophecy, which comprises chapters 1 and 2, he plays a lot of word games with the meaning of Hebrew words. So, for example, he describes an coming invasion in verse 10 onward, down to verse 15. Now, these names he gives to these cities are actually names of specific towns in his region. But each Hebrew name has a meaning, and he plays word games with the meanings of the town. For example, in verse 10, tell it not in Gath. And the sound of Gad and the sound of tell in Hebrew is the same root. So literally, the word plays tell it not in Telltown. And in the second part of verse 10, at Beit La'afra have I rolled myself in the dust. Beit La'afra in Hebrew means the house of dust. And the word play, in dust city, let them roll themselves up in the dust. In verse 11, passer inhabitant of Shavir, in nakedness and shame. Shafir means beauty town, and beauty town is thus beautified. Also, Tsanan means to go forth, and Tsanan, go forth town does not go forth, and so on and so on. As you come to chapter 2, verse 12, he makes one more wordplay. Unfortunately, depending on what translation you use, you'll either have what should be rendered as Botzrah, B-O-Z-R-A-H, B-O-Z-R-A-H, which is true with the King James Version, with my American Standard Version that I'm reading from. But many other renderings simply give us the meaning of Botzrah, which means shepherd town, like a place where sheep are gathered together. But they missed the point. It's not a word game. So let's go look at verse 12. I will surely assemble, O Jacob, all of you. I will surely gather the remnant of Israel. I will put them together as the sheep of Bozrah, as a flock in the midst of the pasture. And there's a word playing between Bozrah and the pasture. That so Sheeptown becomes Bozrah, which is Sheeptown, becomes a refuge for sheep. But sadly, the translation did not always follow was already set in chapter 1, because this is part of the same prophecy as chapter 1. There's a specific city called Bozrah. And Bozrah is better known today by the name of Petra. Bozrah is a Hebrew name, Petra is a Greek name. And the point is that would become the city of refuge for the Jews when they flee the land at the midpoint of the tribulation. But why would they flee here? One reason is given us in Daniel 11, the prophet Daniel, and look at chapter 11. In chapter 11, verses 36 to 45, he describes a war of the Antichrist against the 10 kings, and the 3 kings he kills are all listed in the context. But what we're after is a statement he makes in verse 41. He shall also enter into the glorious land, this will be Israel, and many countries shall be overthrown, but these shall be delivered out of his hand, Edom and Moab and the chief of the children of Ammon. There's always been a principle in Jewish history. One part of the world turns against the Jews. God always opened up another place in the world for the Jews to flee to. Among the key dates of Jewish history is the year 1492. That was the year that beginning with Spain, one European country after another began to expel the Jews from the land. It's no accident that was also the same year Columbus discovered the New World that soon became a haven for Jewish refugees fleeing persecution in Europe. And because the Antichrist gains authority almost of the whole world, and the whole world turns against the Jews, God makes sure that there was one area outside the domain of his control. Edom, Moab, and Ammon, all of these is one country today, the kingdom of the Jordan. What is not the kingdom of the Jordan is ancient Edom, Moab, and Ammon. And the city of Bozrah is in the land of Edom, which today would be southern Jordan. And because only this area to the east of Israel will be free from Antichrist control because of God's sovereignty, that is where the Jews flee to and hide for 3.5 years from the midpoint until Armageddon occurs. Now this will bring on the 4th stage, and you outline Jeremiah 49, verses 13 through 14. The armies of the Antichrist now begin to come down against the Jews of Bozrah or Petra. And once they arrive, that will begin the last 3 days of the tribulation, the last 3 days before the second coming. Because with the Jews under pressure from the armies of the Antichrist outside the walls of Bozrah, they'll finally realize why all these things have happened to them and what they need to do about it. And then they will issue a decree. Let's look at it in the book of Hosea, chapter 6. Hosea, chapter 6. Here we have a division of a chapter at the wrong place because the new context begins in chapter 6, verse 4. And the first 3 verses of chapter 6 belong with chapter 5. As we saw a few moments ago, chapter 5, verse 15 point out that the Messiah will not return to the earth until they confess their offense. And chapter 6, verses 1, 2, and 3 is the meeting of the demand of 5:15. The words are the words of a decree, and decrees are issued by leaders. Come, let's return unto Jehovah, He hath torn, and he will heal us. He hath smitten, and he will bind us up. After 2 days he will revive us. On the third day he will raise us up, and we shall live before him. And let us know, let us follow on to know Jehovah. His going forth is sure as the morning, and he will come unto us as the rain, as the latter rain that waters the earth. In the closing days of the tribulation, in the context of Armageddon, the affliction of 515, the Jewish leaders will issue this call to repentance, and that will trigger the last 3 days. For the first 2 of these last 3 days, they'll confess the national sin, again using the words of Isaiah 53, verses 1 through 9. On the third day, the whole nation will come to faith. In the words of in the words of Isaiah chapter 66, verse 8, they'll be born in 1 day. In the words of Zechariah chapter 3, verse 9, Zechariah 3:9, he removed the iniquity of the land in 1 day. And in Paul's words in Romans 11, verses 25 and 26, all Israel will be saved. And so the 5th stage is Israel's national salvation, and that fulfills the prerequisite. After they cry out his return, on the passages in your outlines, Isaiah 64, Psalm 79, and Psalm 80. Now that will bring on the 6th stage. Initial place of the second coming is going to be the city of Bozrah or Petra. On your outline, the first 2 passages are the shorter versions of it, Micah 2, verse 12 and 13, Habakkuk 3:3. We're going to look at the longer passages with more details, beginning with Isaiah chapter 34. Isaiah chapter 34. Verse 1, Isaiah 34, verse 1, come near, ye nations, to hear, and hearken, ye peoples. Let the earth hear, and the fullness thereof, and the world, and all things that come forth from it. For Jehovah had indignation against all the nations, and wrath against all their armies. He had utterly destroyed them, he has delivered them to the slaughter. The slain also shall be cast out, and the stench of the dead bodies shall come up, and the mountain shall be melted with their blood. Notice he initially states that God has wrath and indignation against all the nations, and more specifically against all the armies of all the nations. And the sword of God is about to strike all the armies of all the nations. When he strikes all these armies of all the nations, exactly where in this world will he do so? Skip down to verse 5. For my sword had drunk its fill in heaven. Behold, it shall come down upon Edom, and upon the people of my curse to judgment. The specific nation where sword strikes all the armies of all the nations is the land of Edom. Today it is southern Jordan. But verse 6 gets even more specific. The sword of Jehovah is filled with blood, it is made fat with fatness, with the blood of lambs and goats, with the fat of kidneys of rams, for Jehovah had a sacrifice in Bozrah, and a great slaughter in the land of Edom. Notice the specific city within the territory of Edom is the city of Bozrah. That's where he will strike all the armies of all the nations. A bit more descriptive is our next example, Isaiah chapter 63. Isaiah chapter 63. In chapter 63, Isaiah is standing somewhere along the mountain range of Israel, looking towards the southeast. And in this vision, he sees a graphic and glorified individual approaching him. And a question and answer session ensues between the prophet and this individual. There'll be two questions asked and two answers given. And the first question is in verse 1. Who is this that comes from Edom with dyed garments from Bozrah? This who is glorious in his apparel, marching in the greatness of his strength. And the answer comes, I that speak in righteousness, mighty to save. Only one person can fit this description, who walks and marches in the greatness of his power, whose very clothing has been glorified by the Shekinah, the Shekinah glory. Only one person can make the claim that this one makes, who speaks in righteousness and mighty to save. And that's not other than Yeshua, Jesus the Messiah, being described not in terms of his first coming, but in terms of his second coming. Now returning to Israel, but notice where he's coming to Israel from. The land is Edom, southern Jordan. The city is Bozrah, or Petra. As the figure in this vision draws closer to the prophet, he notices something else, that although the clothing the Messiah is wearing is glorified by the Shekinah glory, it has also been stained with blood. And that raises the second question in verse 2. Wherefore are you red in your apparel, and your garments like him that tread the winevat? And the answer comes on verse 3. I've trodden the winepress alone, and of the peoples there was no man with me. Yet I trod them in mine anger, and trampled them in my wrath, and their lifeblood is sprinkled upon my garments, I've stained all my raiment. For the day of vengeance was in my heart, and the ear of my redeemed is come. And I looked, and there was none to help, and thy wonders none to uphold. Therefore mine own arm brought salvation unto me, and my wrath upheld me. And I trod down the peoples in mine anger, and made them drunk in my wrath, and I poured out their lifeblood on the earth. And the reason his garments are blood-stained is because he's coming from a tremendous conflict. In the course of this conflict, he will trample the enemy. In the course of the trampling of the enemy, their lifeblood spills over and stains his garment. But notice where the conflict occurred. The land is Edom, or southern Jordan, and the city is Bozrah, or Petra. Notice also that when he enters into fighting with all the armies of the Antichrist, he will do so all by himself. Now the angelic army comes back with him at the second coming, and we church saints come back with him at the second coming, but neither we or the angels participate in the fighting. He will do so all by himself. So if any of you have been practicing maneuvers for this final conflict, you may as well skip it. He won't need our help after all. Now this will bring on the seventh stage. In the seventh stage, the fighting that begins in parting is going to conclude. And that will bring on the final stage, his ascent upon the Mount of Olives. And let's go to Zechariah chapter 14. Zechariah chapter 14. And look at verse 4. His feet shall stand in that day upon the Mount of Olives, which is before Jerusalem on the east. And the Mount of Olives shall be cleft in the midst thereof, towards the east and towards the west. There shall be a very great valley, and half of the mountain shall move towards the north, and half of it to the south. And in verse 5, that will be the way the Jews can flee from the earthquake destroying Jerusalem away from the city. People have taken this verse out of context and assumed he's got at the second coming. That's why he will descend for the first time upon the Mount of Olives. But notice in verse 1 and 2, all the armies come against Jerusalem, and then in verse 3, the Lord shall go forth and fight against all those armies and all those nations, only when the fighting is complete. In verse 4, his feet shall stand that day upon the Mount of Olives. It could be a descent, it could also be an ascent. And his ascension Mount of Olives is when all the fighting is now over with. Now look back at chapter 12 for a moment. Zechariah chapter 12. And notice the sequence he gives. And he says in verse 7, chapter 12, verse 7, "For Jehovah also shall save the tents of Judah first. The glory of the house of David and the glory of the inhabitants of Jerusalem shall not be magnified above Judah." Notice he saves Judah before he saves Jerusalem, and Judah is living in tents. They're no longer living in their homes in Judah, they're living elsewhere, and as we now know, they'll be living in southern Jordan. And so he saves the people of Judah first, and then moves on to save the inhabitants of Jerusalem. That's the sequence he provides in this chapter. There will be four major results of the Campaign of Armageddon. I'll just list these for you and give you the references. Number one, the Antichrist and the false prophet will now be taken and cast into the lake of fire. They'll have the lake of fire all to themselves for its first 1,000 years of habitation. Revelation 19, verses 19 to 21, Revelation 19, 19 to 21. Then Satan will be confined into the abyss. In Revelation 20, verses 1, 2, and 3, Revelation 20, verses 1, 2, and 3, and the abyss has always been a temporary place of confinement for fallen angels or demons. So sometimes when a demon is cast out, he'll spend some time in the abyss, but then be released. There are demons confined there right now to be released as part of the demonic invasions of the tribulation detailed in Revelation chapter 9. Revelation chapter 9. And Satan will be confined there for 1,000 years, but that's also temporary because after 1,000 years, he'll be released one last time. A third event that will be a result of Armageddon will be the judgment of the Gentiles. And all Gentiles who survive the tribulation and survive Armageddon will all be gathered together in the valley of Jehoshaphat where the fighting ended, and then separate into two camps, known as the sheep Gentiles and the goat Gentiles. The sheep Gentiles are the believers of the tribulation who showed their faith by their pro-Semitic works, and they will now be allowed to enter the Messianic kingdom. They'll populate the Gentile nations of the kingdom. It's over these Gentile nations that we church saints will get to co-rule with the Messiah. But the goat Gentiles, who are the anti-Semites of the tribulation, who showed their lack of faith by their anti-Semitic works, who aided in the Antichrist program of Jewish annihilation, they'll be killed and confined to hell and fail to enter the Messianic kingdom. This is Joel chapter 3, verses 1 through 3, Joel 3, verses 1 through 3, also Matthew 25, verses 31 to 46. Matthew 25, verses 31 to 46. And the fourth event will be the resurrection of the tribulation saints that will complete the first resurrection, and church saints and tribulation saints will co-rule with the Messiah over the Gentile cities and Gentile nations of the Messianic kingdom. Now, understanding the precondition of the second coming will show why Satan has always had this war against the Jews and why things like Armageddon is going to happen. The other thing we'll learn from this is why Satan has used one name more than any other name to persecute the Jews. And since the 4th century, 95% of all persecutions against the Jews were in the name of the 3 C's: the church, the cross, and Christ. The church, the cross, and Christ. Satan knows the name they'll have to call upon, so Satan has had the strategy to make the name odious to the Jewish community, and so it has become odious. But most Jews know nothing about the Messiah or Jesus of Scripture. They're reacting to the Jesus of church history. And this brings on the third thing we should note. That is why the importance of both exercising but also supporting Jewish ministries, because part of Jewish ministry is the need to separate the Jesus of church history and the Messiah of Jewish scriptures. Until the Jewish mind can make that separation, it'll be very difficult for come to realize that this Jesus could be the Messiah. But until that understanding could be cleared, it'd be very difficult for a Jew to come to faith. But over the years, we've seen many Jews come to faith because of that. Now, you should have received a blue folder like this. If you will, please take yours out, open up, and on the side that has the picture on it with our words, our history, and so on. The offering taken will be for the support of this ministry. Let me just say a few things about the ministry. The name Ariel is a Hebrew word meaning the Lion of God. And that's a name for Jerusalem. It also tells you what we are. We are Jews who believe in the Messiahship of Yeshua, the Messiahship of Jesus, whom the Bible calls the Lion of the tribe of Judah. We began this ministry back in 1977 on two principles we maintain to this day. And our first principle is to share the gospel with our Jewish people. We do this by setting up branches in different parts of the world. We've been able to branch several branches in the USA because of the sizable Jewish community in America. We have 2 branches in Canada. Outside of North America, here in Europe, we have branches, set up branches, which some are now independent congregations in St. Petersburg, Russia, Kiev in the Ukraine. We also set up branches in Germany, in Hungary. We'll soon be setting a branch also in Italy. And in the Far East, we have branches even in Red China and one in India. And down under, we have branches in Australia and New Zealand. And yes, we do have a branch in Israel in the city of Netanya, a few miles north of Tel Aviv. And God has used the staff rather effectively. Now, in this first area, we're not any different than other Jewish ministries that also have an outreach to the Jewish community. What makes us unique is our second key emphasis, which is intensive Bible discipleship, intensive Bible teaching, but from a Jewish frame of reference. And that means 2 things. First of all, it means putting the Bible into the Jewish context out of which it came. And our writings say in the life of the Messiah takes us back into the 1st century Judaism, 1st century Israel, and we discover why in the 4 Gospels things are written the way they're written, things are said the way they are said, things happen the way they happen because of a specific Jewish frame of reference. The second thing it means is to teach what the Bible says about Israel and God's plan for Israel, past, present, and future, and that's what you got a taste of in this study. We also publish many books, and most of our books have now been sold that we had. We have some books still left, which includes Life of Messiah from a Jewish perspective and some other elements. You can look those over. If you wish to purchase them, you can do so. And we also have a special Bible school. It's called the Program of Messianic Jewish Studies at our Shoshana campus, which is in upstate New York. And we spend the months of July and August in intensive Bible teaching. It's an 8-week program. We go with a 2-week curriculum, then a 3-week curriculum, a 1-week, and a 2-week. And in most of these weeks, it follows a 5-year cycle. So you have to come for 5 summers to get everything we offer, and then receive a certificate of completion. There's one course we teach every year because of its importance, the life of the Messiah, from the Jewish perspective. It's a 25-hour course we cover in 1 week, 3 hours in the morning, 2 hours at night, Monday through Friday. And that covers all the details of the uniqueness of the Jewish background of the ministry of the Messiah. You can come for 1 week, you can come for all 8 weeks, depending how much time you have free. And over the last few years, we've had as many people, many countries, as many as 15 countries come, representing 15 different countries. I haven't gotten the count up yet for this year, but we had, for example, 6 people from Italy, but even more important, 13 people came from Israel with these studies. So there was a lot of pages in the Hebrew text, a lot of Hebrew conversations as well, but anyone is welcome to attend. And we'll put in the new curriculum sometime by the end of November. It'll be available on our webpage. If you look at the page that has the Ariel online course, Now, about just over a year and a half ago, we began an online school, and these are courses you can take no matter where you live, by smartphone, by computer, and so on. And as you turn to it now, you'll see 4 courses being represented, but I've also they taped 8 other courses. Eventually, all of these courses, 25 altogether, will be on this online program, and then you can complete the major Messianic Jewish Studies if you wish to take the courses for credit, but you can also just take it for your own information without bothering the credit issues. But this is made available, and the charges are quite minimal, and that's not the way that you can participate in it. One thing I might mention, we publish a magazine, the Ariel magazine, that looks like this. It has tidbits from our various branches, comes out 4 times a year, but the main thrust is to have anywhere from 3 up to 5 articles teaching different subjects of Scripture from this Messianic Jewish perspective. We don't charge for the magazine. We made a choice to make available free of charge. And there's 2 ways you can receive it. There's a coupon in this pamphlet, and if you want a hard copy like this, we'll need your full name and address. We can mail the magazine to you. But it's also available as an email. If you want the email edition, just your email address would be sufficient. So either the full address or the email address on this slip, and then just tear it off. You can leave it here on the literature table and look at the books and leave it there, and we'll be happy to keep sending you the magazine for long as you want to receive it. The offering we're going to take now is on behalf of this ministry, so we can go ahead and take the offering if we can. I know who's in charge of that. You what? You already took it. You have to take it after this, not before. All right, let's see, what time is it? I'll take about 10 minutes for questions. So if you have any questions, raise your hand, and we'll go from there. Who's got the first question tonight? And your questions do not need to be limited or covered. You're welcome to ask questions in areas of biblical studies, Jewish studies, prophetic studies. Any of those will be fine. Who's got the first question? Okay, we'll skip the first question. Who's got the second question? We'll go from there. Anybody got the second question? Start again. Well, tell everybody. We like people to hear that. That was the second question. Who's got the first question? We can cover that one before we move on. Okay, and we got the third question. All right, I'll close with the rabbi story. Some of you were in the meeting last night, so I won't repeat the stories I told last night. This one I didn't tell last night, and I don't think I've been at this place to tell it. This is my favorite rabbi story, but the background is that in Judaism, we were never taught to pray extemporaneously. All our prayers were through prayer books. So in Judaism, we have a daily prayer book and a Sabbath prayer book, and a prayer book for every special occasion like Passover, Feast of Weeks, Feast of Trumpets, and so on. And this is a rabbi who's now elderly. He's retired from the rabbinate. In his old age, he came to recognize he does not know the God of Israel any better now than when he was a child. He made a very unusual decision for a rabbi. He closed his prayer book and for the first time prayed with his own words. Then maybe he'll hear the voice of God. And if so, he has a few questions to come to know this God of Israel better. He closed his prayer book and began to pray with his own words. In the beginning, he stumbled a lot. He wasn't used to praying that way. After a while, he got smoother, more eloquent. He went on for a very long time, and suddenly he hears a voice from heaven saying, "Yes, Rabbi, what do you want from me?" Rabbi says, "I want to ask you just a few questions to know you better." And God says, "So ask." Well, my first question is, what does time mean to you? And God says, time to me is like this. 1 second is like 1,000,000 years. 1,000,000 years like 1 second. Rabbi says, Well, my second question is, what does money mean to you? And God says about the same. 1 penny is like 1,000,000 euros. And one euro is like 1,000,000, and 1 is like 1,000,000 euros, and 1,000,000 euros like 1 penny. And the rabbi in that case says, I have a third question. May I please have 1 of your pennies? And God said, of course, just wait 1 second. Who's in charge? Okay.
Praise the Lord. Well, at least you won't be disappointed with the offering we've taken up tonight then, brother. Amen. All right, we'll close in a word of prayer, and I wonder if John will close us out. Thank you, John.